Danny, we've been calling this episode From Pencils to Pixels internally, and by internally I mean just me and you. But following our conversation with Roku's Peter Hamilton, where he explained to us that connected TV has finally surpassed linear in terms of viewership, we started to try to understand what does that mean in terms of measuring television. And for listeners out there, at one point in his life, Daniel was actually a former linear TV guy. So can you explain to people how linear TV is measured? Because I have no idea how that works.
James, you're right. I am a recovering linear TV guy. I was at AMC, WeTV, Oxygen, but long before I even got my start there, my first introduction to TV measurement was in the year 1995 as a kid. I got a letter in the mail for my family with $7 of cash in it. The only thing that I had to do to keep that cash was write down everything that my family and I were watching and write it in a journal for 1 month. Physically writing down with pencil on paper what we were watching. Now, since then, measurement has come a long way, and it doesn't just rely on pencil and paper, but with CTV now surpassing linear, that's starting to break a lot of things.
Yeah, so we got really lucky this week, and we got the name that is most synonymous, I think, with measurement, Nielsen, to come on. We have their SVP of strategy, and he explains to us how CTV, digital, multi-device, all the behaviors that we all do is being measured and how it's going to be measured and why it's not going to be just some little kid in Hawaii writing down what him and his parents are watching. So let's get into it.
Matan Bik has spent his career helping advertisers, publishers, and platforms make better use of data to power their marketing businesses. He started his career in the early days of ad tech at eXelate, where he expanded their third-party data marketplace into one of the industry's leading data management platforms. Helping to position the company for an acquisition by Nielsen, today he is the SVP of Strategy and Business Development across TV and digital at Nielsen. So Matan, welcome to the podcast. Really excited to have you here.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
So I think a good place to start would just be a little bit about your background and your journey to Nielsen.
Yeah, so I mean, I joined Nielsen through an acquisition, but I've been at the industry for almost a decade now, which is actually kind of crazy to think about, given how I got started. So I really started in this space through a company called eXelate, which to me represents one of the sort of hardcore legacy ad tech companies. And how I got started there is actually kind of funny. When I graduated from college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I think like most people, I wanted to be a professional athlete, but that when I quickly realized that I wasn't going to make it, that I didn't have the Messi-like talent, I can't say that I knew that I wanted to go into marketing. And I especially didn't know that this second layer of marketing, which we know to be ad tech, even existed. I think that if you would have asked me back then, how do we serve an ad on the online environment, I probably would have looked at you cross-eyed. I had no idea. And so when I graduated college, I went to travel the world for a bit. And then when I came back, I was really adamant about finding a job. And so I sat myself down and I said, okay, what are the things that I'm good at? So I knew that I can speak English. So that was check. I can speak Hebrew. That was a double check. And then I had some experience doing sales. So I kid you not, I went on Google and I literally typed in Israeli companies in New York and I applied to every single one of them that came up. And that's where I got started. And when I look back at it now, in hindsight, that was probably the best job I could have started my career with, because at the time, eXelate was already a known startup. It had its third-party data marketplace, which was a pretty sizable business. But they were also trying to launch a SaaS business, which, as I'm sure you guys know, coming from the startup world, the multiples for a SaaS revenue is much better than multiples for variable revenue. And so they were trying to launch what would become a DMP, or a data management platform. And today, DMPs are very common in the space. You can even argue that they're sort of outdated, but at the time, it was a very, very new concept. And so I got to work with some really brilliant minds that already knew ad tech at eXelate and learn what is a DMP? What is the value proposition that they can offer to the market across advertisers, publishers, ad tech companies, and really understand how do we both commercialize it and productize it. And I was starting from the bottom, I was the guy who was doing all the grunt work. So all the custom decks, all the RFPs that would come in, which at the time you could argue wasn't the funnest job, but it really gave me an understanding of how ad tech works. How do segments get refreshed? How do you do a server-server integration? Why do you need tags? What is the difference between a DSP and an SSP? And the reason I mention this is because having that knowledge gave me the tools to understand what I would consider the details that matter in ad tech, and then go and exploit that into Nielsen when we got acquired. Because when Nielsen acquired us, they were just starting to go through their digital transformation. So all of a sudden, my job became from working at a startup to go into Nielsen and help them understand how they can digitize their products better. How can ad tech help them expand into an omni-channel world? And how can I take eXelate and expand it into a broader offering that could better serve much larger enterprise clients that Nielsen was working with? So this was the birth of the Nielsen Marketing Cloud. And then today, I work very closely with some of Nielsen's most strategic enterprise clients to help them understand how do we and the industry together bridge the gap between traditional and addressable media, which you can also categorize as sort of linear TV and digital. So that's my journey from a high level.
And you mentioned that you're actually doing this podcast now from Israel, and you mentioned all the kind of Israeli innovation that has sort of taken place in ad tech. I think just for listeners, just in general, given how impressive sort of, I think like in terms of population impact that Israel has had on ad tech, it probably outkicks its coverage by a shocking amount. But what is it about the talent base there that makes it, so ripe for innovation kind of in ad and marketing tech?
So I think it's actually two things. So one is, unlike most countries, when Israelis finish high school, they go into the military. And so depending on where you go in the military, if you go into active like military duty, you do all the physical grunt work, but there's a whole other world to the military, which is all about technology. And if you look at the majority of the Israeli startups, the majority of them you could probably trace down to one or two, regiments or platoons within the Israeli military that were all about technology. And in those sort of platoons, they get to work on the most cutting edge technology for military purposes. And then what happens is when they finish after they serve their 3 years, they acquired all this knowledge. And what they do is they look to retrofit that technology into the civilian world. And so you have a lot of startups that are not just ad tech coming out of Israel. Like a lot of them start data security companies. But at the time, there was a sort of like an Israeli mafia that started ad tech, and they all started their companies. And then at some point, Israel is just such a small market compared to the US that at some point they all have to move over to the US in order to make it big. And so I would say it's sort of the military heritage that we have to deal with, and then also the size of the market, which even if you own the market, it's not even like owning Connecticut. So
going back to your experience at eXelate and building out the third-party data marketplace and into a DMP, so data management platform, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the trend that we've seen since that era, where data management platforms, DMPs, have transitioned into customer data platforms, CDPs, and that was kind of the next wave of interest from a lot of companies. But also third-party data marketplaces are still popular, right? Maybe they don't get quite as much press as some of the other data platforms, but third-party data marketplaces are still heavily used. And some could argue that they're even more impactful for businesses today as, cookies and privacy concerns and other signals are being stripped away. So curious to get your thoughts on one, the wave into customer data platforms, but how that plays into the larger space of data marketplaces and data sharing, and how companies are kind of using that to accelerate their advertising.
Yeah. So there's a lot in that question. So I'll try to break it down. So the first one was about, the move from DMPs to customer data, which is CDPs essentially. So you're right. DMPs were really focused on cookies and anonymous identifiers. CDPs then came about and said, hey, you have a CRM, known users that you really need to do a combination. You need to be able to do the same type of segmentation work and targeting. And so I think it was sort of a natural evolution of a DMP into a CDP. there was a time where you could argue that you needed both in order to be successful, because a CDP gives you your known customers, your known universe, and a DMP and third-party data gives you the scale to expand. Because in marketing, it's not just about retargeting your own users, it's about finding and acquiring new customers. And even if you're using a lot of first-party data, you need third-party data, or you need some sort of big data set to prospect against. And this is where there's still value to third-party data marketplaces. The reality is that they have changed tremendously from when I was when I was working on like the hardcore eXelate third-party data marketplace business, because of the changes that happened. And so data marketplaces have sort of consolidated into more persistent identifiers. And I would say that there's not a lot of data marketplaces out there that could sustain the scale that they used to have with just persistent identifiers, such as HEMS and CTV IDs and first party IDs. And so that makes it a little bit challenging. But I do agree with you that there's definitely a value for third party data going forward. However, first party data is definitely king, and we hear this across the ecosystem. The second question, remind me what was the second part of that question was?
More about kind of moving forward, how you think third-party data marketplaces, but even beyond that, just the use of third-party
Uh,
data is impacting advertisers. And so some examples, right? Shopify audiences, there's other kind of co-ops of company data that are being used.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I can tell you, like, one of the trends that I've seen is historically the way that data marketplaces would work, or the way that advertisers would combine their first party data with third party data, would be they would be sending their first party data to some platform and then overlaying their third party data on top of it, creating audiences, and then syndicating them out. What I'm seeing in the ecosystem is that now advertisers are requesting the third party data to make it to their place or to their secure environment, data lake, whatever it might be. They don't want their first party data moving anywhere. So data has to flow into their own environment where they can then run their own analytics in an environment that they feel safe. And then they then share that information with the media platforms that they're running media on, and also non-traditional ways to what was done in the past, more through clean rooms as opposed to going through an onboarder or a live ramp or a new star or something of that sort.
And when it comes to like the clean room space in particular, like I think it's a kind of an area of MarTech that everyone talks about, but doesn't have like kind of a great kind of understanding of in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Could you just explain to listeners like how it really works? Like, why is it actually clean?
Yeah.
And then how does like Nielsen interact with them in particular?
Yeah. So I would say that there's the version of a clean room today, and then there's going to be the version of a clean room tomorrow. So sort of like the promise of clean rooms, because the premise of a clean room, and the funny thing is that clean rooms, they're not actually a new technology. They've been used in the financial services space for quite some time. It's just the technology that's been retrofitted into advertising because of all the privacy changes that are happening. But net, the premise behind clean room is that data needs to be shared. Sorry, data needs to be merged, but it can't be shared. So every party wants to keep their own data protected. And so a clean room is an environment where two parties can make a match between known users that both sides share without actually sharing their entire data set with one another. And so today, at least from what I can see, the state of clean rooms is really as a matching agent. The promise of a clean room is that not only you would be able to do matching, but then on top of it, you would be able to run analytics and run really sophisticated computation that you can then run, which you can then use for your marketing business, your marketing operations. Today, what happens is there's a match, and then each party knows which audiences match with the other party, and then you have to take the data back to your own sort of safe environment, run the analytics. So there's sort of the clean room today and the clean room tomorrow. And then to answer your question about how Nielsen leverages clean room, and I don't think it's just Nielsen, it's just measurement companies in general. Clean rooms are becoming the de facto of how measurement companies get access to both impression data, so the data that the publishers own, as well as the first party data that advertisers want to bring into their measurement in order to cascade their own view of the world and measure against their own specific audiences. So I think that's where it is. I think clean rooms still have some ways to go in terms of making sure that they give the industry, the computing and the analytics power that is needed in order to really support all the use cases that are done today across planning, activation, and measurement. But it's definitely an area to keep an eye on, and an area that's booming.
Let's maybe take a step back in history and kind of look at Nielsen, because I do want to get back to the data clean room conversation. But even before then, I think it's helpful. Nielsen, probably most listeners remember Nielsen as kind of the TV ratings company, that every night if you worked in TV, there were overnight ratings, there were T+3, T+7, they had journals, they had, a small sample of set-top boxes that measured all this. And then a lot of your journey has been the digital transformation at Nielsen. So can you
Yeah.
walk us through a little bit how Nielsen went from that discipline, so TV centric and so measurement heavy in that respect, to where they are today and that journey to get there?
Yeah.
And also, and how did it work before digital? Was it
Yeah.
like literally people with like pens and paper? Do you know?
The simple answer is yes. So the thing to keep in mind with Nielsen, so Nielsen is 100 years old company, which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
And just to give you a sense of, like, if you think about where the world was 100 years ago, so Nielsen started in 19, don't quote me on this, but 1923. 1923 was the first year that the traffic light, as we know it, so the with the three lights, so the red, the yellow, and the green, was either first invented or utilized in the United States. So that just gives you a sense of where the world was from a data and technology perspective. And if you think about Nielsen's evolution and where Nielsen is now, the evolution of Nielsen really follows the evolutions of consumers and how they interact with content and where they interact with content. And so, yes, back then, actually, I think the first media outlet that Nielsen ever measured was in 1930, and it was actually the traditional radio, and it was just people journaling what they listened to. And then in 1950, they started to measure linear TV through the diaries and the journals that most people would think about from a legacy perspective and associate Nielsen with. But as consumers starting to interact with more digital properties, and as consumers starting to interact with more media channels, whether it's computer, mobile, CTV today, digital out of home, programmatic theater, et cetera, Nielsen has had to evolve its use of data and technology in order to be able to continually cover those media outlets and provide an understanding of how media consumption works. And so today you're talking about a completely different system that has evolved to be, or that has evolved to be very interoperable with the different channels that we have today. Because if you think about what Nielsen needs to do in order to be successful, Nielsen needs to be able to bring in all the impression data that is out there and where consumers are getting exposed to ads. And that changes drastically from channel to channel. I'm sure you guys know this at Snap, but every every company, every channel, every publisher has their own nuances in terms of the data that they have available, data structures that they have available, the privacy and security regulations that they have to abide by. And Nielsen, and in fact, any measurement company that wants to do cross media measurement needs to be able to capture all of it if they're going to provide value to the advertiser who wants to be able to measure their entire media plan holistically and comparably one against one another. And so it's a combination of technology, data, and bringing that all together in order to derive at what can be the most accurate truth of what is happening in the United States or in the world around media consumption.
Nielsen having gone through that transition and moving from a really TV centric company to one that is now spanning multiple channels, what do you think, digital native kind of industry folks and maybe more traditional TV or even CTV specific folks can learn from one another? And as you've seen that transition and other people in Nielsen have seen that transition, what are some of the takeaways that maybe both sides can take away and actually benefit the industry as a whole?
Yeah. So it's a really interesting and I think very relevant question to today's world, because as consumers are spending more time across more devices, that is also leading advertisers to buy across more channels. And what's happening is that you sort of have your traditional linear TV buyers all of a sudden colliding with your shiny new digital buyers. And both of them come from very different perspective, different cultures, and different KPIs. And so this is a really, really exciting time to be in this space because of this sort of collision. And where you see this collision more is actually in CTV. And I can just tell you from my experience, there's sort of a conception that because digital is newer, then they know everything and linear TV just needs to adapt because it's so old. But the reality is that there's a lot of cool things that linear TV can actually teach digital. And one of those things is the incorporation of co-viewing into the way that into the operation of the industry. So if you think about digital, and when I say digital, let's focus on computer and mobile. Generally, when we associate computer and mobile, it's it's a singular experience, meaning I have one device and it represents one person. And if you think about what that means from like the details of how the industry works, when you buy in digital across computer and mobile, you generally track the ads that are served. And an ad that is served also equals an ad delivered and it equals one person. And so you basically, if you serve 10 ads, you're going to pay for 10 ads. In linear TV, it's actually very different because linear TV and CTV, it's a shared device. So you can have multiple individuals in front of the screen at any given time, and that fluctuates throughout the day. And so the concept of one ad equals one person doesn't really exist in linear TV and CTV. It's actually one person, one ad can, and one impression can equal multiple individuals. And so as digital is moving to CTV and as linear TV buyers are moving into CTV, digital is having to adapt to the concept that you can't just bill off of served ads because they don't actually equal the ads that are delivered. Because on CTV you can serve one ad, but you can actually deliver the ad to three people because you're watching a show together. And it's really, really important for both sides to understand that. And when I say both sides, I mean the publishers and the advertisers, because injecting co-viewing into the operation is really critical, both to make sure that publishers get their fair share of value because they're delivering more impressions than what is actually being served. And it's really, really important from an advertiser perspective, because if you want to know your true reach and your true frequency, you have to incorporate co-viewing into it because that is an accurate reflection of what's happening across the TV screen. And if you don't, then you risk oversaturating your consumers and or overspending to reach a certain threshold.
And will that manifest itself in like some form of SDK on your phone, and that's how the TV knows if it's in proximity? Like, how will that work, 5 years from now when like there's 20 people in a room watching YouTube TV with the YouTube app on their phone? Like, will that be an example of where co-viewing can be like kind of automated and kind of work the way that like digital tends to work today?
So in terms of how we get to co-viewing, so I can tell you how co-viewing is sort of derived at today. Where it will be, how it would evolve in terms of getting to it and calculating it will really depend on the technology and what consumers are willing to accept from a privacy perspective. But today, the way that it works is if you think about, there's two things that you need to know in order to understand co-viewing. The first is you need to understand the household that the TV is at, or you need to understand the household that the impression is being served at. And so you essentially need to create a roster of the individuals that are in the household. And that generally comes from the use of a device ID. So a Roku ID or a Samsung TV ID. And then the second thing is the content. So the content of what is being shown in the context of the ad can really tell you a lot about who is in front of the screen. So if, for example, you know that there's a household with four individuals, one mom, one dad, and two kids, and there is a late night news show, most likely it's the parents in front of the screen. If it's a kids show, then you can assume that there is only one parent and the kid, as an example. And the way that it works is when measurement companies integrate with publishers, they need access to both the content information and the device information to give you the household roster. And then you basically create a viewer assignment model that is correlated and calibrated against a panel where you know that certain people have watched certain things at certain times, and you create a model off of that to then extrapolate that. And while it's a very new concept for digital, that concept of using these types of calibrations and models has been used for years in linear TV and has been battle tested for years with billions and billions of dollars being transacted on top of these metrics. And so
Interesting.
from a digital perspective, it's like you gotta digital is very used to having, you know, I need to know exactly the individual who saw the ad, and then I need to track their conversion across multiple sites. But the reality is that is a great way to look at things. That is, if you can, absolutely look at it that way. But with everything that's happening with signal loss because of cookie deprecation and ATT and privacy regulations, that world is slimming down more and more. And so
Mm.
digital is going to have to rely on some of the, we'll call it the methodologies that linear TV has used to identify people across shared devices to mm, make measurement possible across areas where there's not a lot of signal, basically make that possible.
Are there I don't know a ton about sort of the streaming space, to be honest, but I was just reading about like Netflix and a lot of the ad supported streaming services that are going out there. Are they all playing nice with Nielsen and like allowing measurement to take place on those platforms, or are they sort of operating more like traditional walled gardens?
So I would say I'll take Nielsen out of the equation here because I think it's a question that is applicable to all measurement companies. And I think that there is a very big incentive for streaming platforms to be able to showcase their incrementality, their unique reach against other channels. And the way to do that is by using unbiased measurement that can help you showcase that. Because everything that is digital is chasing and is trying to consume the linear TV budgets that are moving over to digital. And the reality is that it's billions and billions of dollars. And so if you look at the walled gardens, even your Googles of the world, your Facebook of the world, they all in some way, shape, or form are leaning into measurement because it's important to them to showcase to the advertisers that they can replace or complement some of their linear TV buys.
You mentioned that, the traditional digital platforms, so the walled gardens, are trying to take TV budgets. Obviously, TV budgets are trying to get digital budgets. And so there is
Yeah.
this tension between the two. I am curious your thoughts on how digital measurement moves forward, knowing that people are doing two or three things at once, interacting with two or three platforms at once. They're watching Roku, but they're on Twitter or they're on Facebook. And so what that does to the value of the attention, right? The budgets can only go up so much. And right now it's binary, either Facebook gets it or TV, CTV gets it. But it seems to me that like attention should play a factor. If I'm watching TV and on Instagram, I'm not paying attention to either, you know, with full kind of with my full attention. And so maybe that value is less. How do you think about that over time, the interaction, the interplay between platforms and my engagement with multiple platforms at once?
Yeah, so I think so. One, attention has been a very, very hot topic in the industry, and depending on who you ask, I can see it. I can see it both sides. So there's no doubt that attention has some role to play. The question is, and this is really the question that the industry is fighting off of, is it a metric that you can transact off of, or is it a metric that you optimize for? There's sort of two arguments to it. One, the publisher can say, look, my job is to give you the advertising space. It's your job to drive the attention through an interactive ad or to an interesting and relevant ad to the user. So I can't be dinged if I gave you the perfect space, the perfect user, but your ad just wasn't good. On the flip side, you have sort of the buy side, the advertisers and the agencies. They see attention as like if I want to make sure that my users, the people that I'm spending money to reach, are actually paying attention to my ad. If you ask my personal opinion, this is not Nielsen's opinion, but in my personal opinion, is that attention is definitely a metric that is needed and can be used for optimization of a buy, but it's going to be very hard to make it the base of a buy, meaning the currency of which it needs to transact off of. Because one, at the moment, there's no standards to what attention is. There's different companies measuring attention different ways. So until we get that standardization and until we get both sides of this of the aisle comfortable with what attention means and what it does to the campaign, I think we're going to see it as an add-on measurement optimization tool for buyers to use when they see fit.
And this may be something that this is pretty arbitrary, but we had a debate about this at Snapchat often. What do you think, just given that you work at a measurement company, what do you think the accurate measurement amount of time for a video view should be? Because everyone was fighting about it, and I saw on Twitter yesterday people are still fighting about this. But like, have you seen? I mean, to some extent, I guess like attention and impact come from duration, potentially. But do you guys have a point of view of like, or maybe take it off the Nielsen app, just like what you've seen, which is
Yeah.
like someone's paying attention, like that. This actually resonated. Do you have like something that you would say is sort of best practice?
Yeah, so I mean, so there's actually guidelines around it. So if you look at the MRC, which is sort of the auditing board that makes sure that Nielsen does what it's supposed to do, and it doesn't just audit Nielsen, it audits a bunch of other companies like Double Verify and basically any measurement company out there. They classify an impression, and then the duration is 2 seconds. So that is sort of, and if you think about it, it's actually a really, really important thing to standardize because if you don't treat impressions the same at their base level, then the measurement will have a bias towards one channel or the other. And measurement companies need to be unbiased. The moment that you lose that, then you're not really a measurement company. And so being able, and this is one of the transitions that Nielsen and the ecosystem is going through as TV is becoming more digital, how do you ensure that a CTV impression or a linear TV impression is comparable to a mobile or desktop impression? That is one of the big shifts that is happening in the ecosystem as the linear TV budgets are moving towards digital as well.
It's a good, I think, transition into kind of our kind of close out series of questions where we want to get your kind of quick take on a few of those. And so the first one there, you mentioned some of the question marks around measurement or kind of auditing to make sure that everyone's using the same measurement language essentially. And so if I'm an advertiser, what is my number one question to ask a measurement partner?
I think the number one question is, how are you ensuring that your measurement is tied to reality? And what I mean by that is there's a fundamental fact that no one can change, and that is there's 24 hours in a day. In those 24 hours, there's so many people in the United States or the world, depending which market you're operating in, and they only have so much time to consume content. And so the question has to be, how are you making sure that your numbers, as you're reporting different publishers, are all adding up to reality? Because what a lot of times you see, and you see this a lot in ad tech, you have numbers that are just so over extrapolated that there's no way that they can represent the population accurately. And very different than, I came from eXelate targeting, you guys were at Snap. I'm sure you saw this. There was a world where like in the targeting world, it was all about scale. So you were okay if you had an auto intender segment that included half of the United States population because it gave you scale. But in measurement, you have to have accuracy. And so making sure that all the numbers add up to reality is really, really important.
Throughout your career, what would you say is the biggest single innovation that you've seen?
So honestly, because I was nomading for a while, I would say the virtual backgrounds and video calls. That has that has saved me a bunch of time. But honestly, I think the biggest innovation is yet to come. And I hate to be like, say AI, but I do think that AI is going to make our ecosystem kind of turn it upside down in terms of the efficiency and the speed at which it could operate. And so I think the best is yet to come, to be honest.
That it took the it's kind of right out of our next question, but you answered what that evolution looks like over the next 5 to 10 years. But can you put your finger on? We're going to ask you to put your finger on one that you're kind of most excited about within AI.
So actually, this is, well, I guess it's related to measurement, but one of the really cool things that I've seen in AI is the idea of using AI to do product placement on videos and creative videos that have already been recorded. So as an example, there's a company called Rembrandt, which was actually started by Omar, who we used to compete with back when he ran Blue Kai. Blue Kai and actually used to compete head to head. But anyways, what that company does is they retroactively can insert products into videos that were already recorded. And if you think about what that does to the value of content, it like makes it exponentially more valuable to creators, because you could go retroactively and monetize content across multiple advertisers at once. So like imagine you watch a Friends episode and all of a sudden the pizza that's being delivered is Papa John's, and they open up the TV and there's Netflix. There's just so much that you could do with it that I think there's a lot to come in that space.
Yeah. And I think we've talked about Rembrandt on a previous episode on this podcast. So shout out to those guys, what they're building. It's pretty cool.
A fellow Imperium Ventures portfolio company.
There we go. And so we've covered a lot of heavy topics. So we're going to soften it a little. Since you're from Nielsen, what are your top 3 TV shows, streaming shows right now?
So I would say that I haven't watched a lot lately. I think the last show that I watched was Suits. And then I watched Billions whenever it comes out. And then what else did I watch? Oh, and Fauda. You guys ever watch Fauda?
3 I'm adding to the list.
There you go.
But before we close out, Matan, this has been a great conversation. Where can listeners find you or learn more about Nielsen?
To learn more about Nielsen, you can go on the website or obviously just ping me. I wouldn't say I'm the most socially active person, but you could definitely find me on LinkedIn and just ping me, and I'll be happy to chat, talk through whatever you guys want to talk about.
All right. We'll include that in the show notes. Matan, this has been great. Quite an education. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for doing this all the way from Israel, man. We really appreciate it.
Hey, we're only an ocean away.
Before you go, we need your help. If you enjoyed this week's episode of Taking Inventory, then subscribe or rate wherever you listen to the podcast. And while you're at it, please share this episode or your favorite episode with a friend. We'll be back next week with another episode of Taking Inventory. See you then.